Zalvora Prime was a world spoken of in hushed tones across the galaxy, a place where no sane traveler dared to venture. It was home to the Exalvorons, towering reptilian beasts with claws that could tear through steel and fangs that gleamed like blades. Entire civilizations had fallen trying to tame them, and warlords who once dreamed of conquest had perished in the dense, unforgiving jungles of their homeworld. Yet, despite their savagery, the Exalvorons were not mindless creatures. They had built their own form of civilization, one shaped by blood, war, and an unshakable code of honor. They allowed no outsiders. No diplomats had ever returned from their lands. No merchant had ever struck a deal and lived to tell of it. But then, for the first time in history, they sent a message. And it was not a declaration of war, it was a plea for help. The distress signal had been unexpected, and the message itself had sent a wave of confusion through the United Terran fleet. The Exalvorons, the most fearsome species in the known galaxy, were facing an extinction crisis. Their young, their future, were rejecting their own kind, refusing to bond with their parents. The Exalvoran elders, in an act that went against centuries of isolation, had requested human assistance. It was a decision that stunned even the highest-ranking officials of the Terran Federation. Why humans? Why, out of the countless species in the galaxy, would the Exalvorons turn to the one race they had never encountered in peace? These questions plagued Captain Elias Carter as he and his small team prepared for a mission that had never been attempted before, setting foot on Exalvora Prime and walking among its people. When their vessel landed, the air was thick with tension. The Exalvorans who greeted them were massive, their scales glistening under the blood-red sky, their piercing golden eyes watching the humans with unreadable expressions. Elias had seen war-torn worlds, had stared down monstrous creatures on distant planets, but standing before the Exalvoran High Warden, he felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. These were not just predators. They were something far more dangerous beings who had mastered their own savagery and forged it into a civilization that had survived longer than humanity itself. The problem was worse than the humans had expected. In massive underground hatcheries, hundreds of young Exalvorans sat in eerie silence, refusing to acknowledge their parents. Normally, the bond between an Exalvoran hatchling and its guardian was instantaneous. The young were supposed to recognize their own, to connect with their ancestors' memories passed down through their genetic code. But these hatchlings were different. They stared blankly at their own kind, unresponsive, distant. Yet the moment Elias and his team stepped forward, something changed. The young turned their heads. Eyes that had been dull with detachment suddenly sparked with something new curiosity. Connection. For reasons they could not yet explain, their young responded to humans in a way they had never seen before. Elias watched as a small Exalvoran hatchling, no bigger than a wolf, cautiously approached him, sniffing the air before pressing its scaled forehead against his leg. A creature bred for war, one that would one day grow into a towering warrior feared across the stars, was now seeking comfort from a human. And it wasn't just one. The other younglings began shifting, drawn toward the humans with an instinctive trust that defied logic. Elias and his team conducted tests. They discovered something even more shocking. Deep within the genetic code of the Exalvorans lay traces of something ancient, remnants of a forgotten connection to humanity. It was impossible. The Exalvorans had never interacted with humans before. Their civilizations had evolved light years apart, separated by the vast, merciless void of space. And yet, hidden within their very biology, was proof that their ancestors had once known a species eerily similar to mankind. The implications were staggering. Had humans and Exalvorans met in some forgotten age? Had their ancestors once walked the same worlds? But not everyone welcomed these discoveries. There were those among the Exalvorons who saw this revelation as an insult to their traditions, a sign of weakness. To them, the humans were not saviors, they were a threat. And threats had to be eliminated. The attack came under the cover of darkness. A faction of Exalvoran warriors, unwilling to let their species become dependent on outsiders, launched an assault on the human encampment. Alarms blared as Elias and his team scrambled for cover, their weapons useless against the overwhelming force of their attackers. It was not a battle they could win. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a piercing roar echoed through the air. A young Exalvoran, barely past its hatching phase, stood defiantly in front of Elias, its tiny form trembling but unwavering. It bared its teeth at the approaching warriors, its golden eyes burning with something primal, something undeniable. The sight stopped the attackers in their tracks. A Exalvoran hatchling, willing to defend a human? It was unthinkable. The hesitation was all the elders needed. The High Warden himself stepped forward, his massive form casting a shadow over the battlefield. With a single command, the rebels were subdued. In the aftermath, the Exalvorans made a decision that would change their civilization forever. They would not turn away from the truth of their past. They would not reject the bond that had awakened between their young and the humans. Instead, they would embrace it. Humanity had become more than just an ally. They had become something far more sacred, their caretakers, their guides. For the first time in Exalvoran history, they acknowledged that their future could not be built on isolation and violence alone. It had to be shared. As Elias and his team prepared to leave, they knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy had changed that day. The most feared species in existence had placed their trust in humanity. And in return, humanity had discovered something they never expected, a connection older than time itself, a bond that had survived the vastness of space, waiting to be rekindled. For in the hearts of the most savage beasts, humanity had found something unexpected. Not just trust, not just loyalty, but family. The Exalvorans had never known fear. Their civilization had been forged in the crucible of war, their history written in blood and conquest. Towering reptilian beings with armored scales and eyes that burned like molten gold, they were the undisputed apex predators of their world. Their strength was legendary, their honor absolute, and their loyalty unshakable, but now, for the first time in countless generations, they faced an enemy they could not defeat with claws and fangs. Their future was slipping away, not from war, not from famine, but from something far more insidious. Their young were rejecting them. Deep within the stone-carved halls of the High Warden's citadel, the elders of the Exalvoran race gathered in tense silence. Massive torches lined the cavernous chamber, casting flickering shadows on the hardened faces of warriors who had never known defeat. But now, they looked upon each other with uncertainty. At the center of the room stood Captain Elias Carter and his team, the only humans ever allowed to set foot on Exalvora Prime. They were outsiders, smaller and physically weaker than the Exalvorans, yet it was they who had been called upon in this time of crisis. Elias could feel the weight of 100 piercing stares as the High Warden spoke, his voice like distant thunder. Our younglings do not bond with us. They do not see us as their own. If this continues, our lineage will end. Tell us, human, why do they accept you but turn from their own blood? Elias had no easy answer. He had spent weeks among the Exalvorans, studying their young, observing the way they reacted to their own kind with disinterest, yet responded to humans with an instinctive trust that defied all logic. It was more than simple curiosity. The hatchlings sought out human presence, pressing against them for warmth, following them with wide, unblinking eyes, mimicking their gestures. It was as though something deep within their very essence recognized humanity in a way even the Exalvorans themselves did not. And then came the revelation that had stunned them all. Deep within Exalvoran genetic code, hidden beneath layers of evolutionary complexity, were traces of something impossibly ancient. A connection to a species eerily similar to humanity. The idea had sent shockwaves through the elders. Exalvorans prided themselves on their unbroken bloodline, on the purity of their warrior heritage. The suggestion that their kind might share an ancestral bond with another species, especially one as physically unassuming as humans, was almost heretical. Some refused to believe it, dismissing it as scientific error. But the evidence was undeniable. Somewhere, in the forgotten depths of time, their ancestors had known humans, or something very much like them. Not all Exalvorans welcomed this revelation. Elias had seen the way some warriors looked at him and his team, the barely restrained hostility in their burning eyes. To them, the humans were not saviors, but intruders. Their presence was a threat to the old ways, a sign of weakness. The Exalvarons had never relied on another species for survival. They had never needed help. Until now. And there were those who would rather see the young perish than allow their people to become dependent on outsiders. The attack came without warning. The night was thick with the scent of rain as Elias sat reviewing his notes in the temporary research camp set up near the hatcheries. The sound of distant thunder masked the first few gunshots, but the sudden roar of an explosion shattered the quiet. Alarms blared as fire erupted along the perimeter. Elias barely had time to grab his weapon before the shadows moved. Massive figures burst through the defensive line, Exalvoran warriors, their scales glinting in the firelight, their eyes burning with violent intent. They were not the enemy, yet here they were, attacking their own kind to rid themselves of human influence. The battle was brief but brutal. The rebel Exalvorans tore through the camp, their sheer strength overwhelming the human defenses. Elias and his team fought to protect the younglings, shielding them from the chaos, but they were outnumbered. Just as Elias thought all was lost, a deafening roar echoed through the battlefield. A young Exalvoran, barely past its hatching phase, had stepped forward. It was small compared to the warriors, its scales still dark with youth, but its stance was unshakable. It let out a snarl, baring its teeth at the approaching rebels. And then it did something that no Exalvoran had ever done before. It lunged, not at the humans, but in front of them, standing as a shield. The sight sent shockwaves through the ranks. A hatchling, willing to protect a human? It was unthinkable. The hesitation was all the loyalists needed. The High Warden himself arrived with his honor guard, their weapons drawn. The rebellion was crushed in moments, the surviving traitors dragged before the council to answer for their crimes. In the aftermath, the truth could no longer be denied. The younglings did not reject their own kind out of rebellion or sickness. They were not broken. They were simply awakening to something the Exalvorans had long forgotten: a connection, a bond that transcended war and history. The future of their species was not one of isolation, but one of change. Elias stood before the High Warden one last time. He knew this was a turning point in galactic history. The Exalvorans were not a race that bowed easily. They did not forget slights, nor did they forgive weakness. But in that moment, as the High Warden looked upon the humans who had saved his people, he did something no Exalvoran leader had ever done before. He lowered his head not in submission, but in respect. The Exalvoran people owe you a debt, Elias Carter, and we do not forget our debts. For the first time in their long and violent history, the Exalvorans had chosen not war, but trust. And in doing so, they had secured the future of their kind, not as conquerors, not as the last of a dying breed, but as allies, standing side by side with the only species in the galaxy their young truly recognized, not as enemies, not as outsiders, but as family. The moment Dr. Elias Carter saw the DNA sequence, he knew something was wrong. The research station orbiting HFY 7 had received countless samples from across the galaxy, each carrying the unique genetic code of different alien species. But this particular sequence was impossible. It belonged to a species humanity had never encountered before, a reptilian race known as the Exalvorans. Massive, warlike creatures, their civilization thrived on strength and honor, their warriors feared across the stars. They had always been considered entirely alien, their biology distinct from any known race. And yet, here it was, a fragment of their DNA undeniably linked to humanity. Elias ran the tests again, cross-checking the results against human genetic markers. Each time, the same conclusion emerged. Deep within Exalvoran genetics lay something familiar, something impossibly ancient. The sequences weren't identical to human DNA, but they were too close to be a coincidence. It was as if, buried beneath thousands of years of evolution, there was a forgotten connection between their species, one that had never been recorded in any history. But how could that be? Humanity had only recently expanded into the stars. while the Exalvorans had ruled their part of the galaxy for centuries. The only logical explanation was unthinkable. At some point in the distant past, humans and Exalvorans had been linked by something far older than either of them. The research station had no answers, but there was one place that might. Xalvora Prime, homeworld of the Exalvorans. No human had ever set foot on its surface without permission, and those who had attempted to do so without an invitation had never returned. But Elias knew that if he wanted to uncover the truth, he would have to take the risk. The Terran Federation authorized a diplomatic mission, knowing that a discovery of this magnitude could change the balance of power in the galaxy. If humanity and Exalvorans shared a common past, what else had been forgotten? When Elias and his team arrived, the Exalvorans were waiting. Towering figures with scales dark as midnight and eyes that burned with intelligence they did not trust easily. Yet the High Warden, their most respected leader, agreed to hear Elias out. He listened in silence as the human scientist presented his findings, his massive form motionless as the implications of the discovery sank in. Then, after a long pause, he did something unexpected. He agreed to take Elias to a place no human had ever seen. They traveled deep into the jungles of Exalvora Prime, through a land untouched by time. The air was thick with humidity, and towering trees cast eerie shadows in the twilight. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became, as if the very planet itself was holding its breath. And then, at last, they reached their destination, an ancient ruin, hidden beneath layers of vegetation. Carvings covered the stone walls, depicting creatures that looked eerily familiar. Not Exalvoran. Not fully human. Something in between. Elias moved closer, brushing away centuries of dust. His heart pounded as he traced the symbols with his fingers, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The carvings told a story, one of war, of destruction, of a civilization lost to time. And then, at the very center of the ruins, he saw them. Two figures standing side by side. One unmistakably human. The other, Exalvoran. Not as enemies. Not as strangers. But as allies. The High Warden exhaled slowly, his voice deep and measured. This place is forbidden. Even our own people do not come here. It speaks of an age long before our recorded history. An age we chose to forget. Elias turned to face him, his mind racing. But why? What happened here? For a long moment, the Exalvoran leader said nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. We were not always what we are now. Long ago, our ancestors were different, and yours were there beside them. But something happened, something that forced us apart. The records say we were betrayed, though we do not know by whom. We chose to forget, to erase the past and forge a new path. But it seems the past does not forget us. Elias stared at the ruins, at the undeniable proof that humanity and Exalvorans had once stood together. But if they had been allies, if they had shared a connection so deep that it was still hidden within their very DNA, then what had torn them apart? And more importantly, who had wanted them to forget? The realization sent a chill down his spine. Someone, or something, had ensured that neither species remembered the truth. And if that was the case, then whatever secret lay buried in this ancient place was more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The moment the alarms blared through the Terran battleship Resolute, Captain Adrian Voss knew something was terribly wrong. The ship had been stationed at the edge of the neutral zone, a border between human-controlled space and the Dominion, a powerful alien empire that had sworn peace after decades of brutal conflict. For years, they had honored that truce, exchanging resources and information, even standing together against common threat. But now, as the tactical display lit up with hostile markers closing in fast, it was clear that the peace had been nothing more than an illusion. The Dominion had betrayed them. Shields up. All stations to battle readiness. Adrian's voice cut through the chaos as officers rushed to their posts. The Dominion fleet was massive, larger than any force they had ever fielded in a single engagement. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment, gathering their strength in secret. The Resolute was a powerful warship, but it was just one vessel against an entire armada. As the first energy blast struck the shields, the ship trembled violently. The Dominion had no intention of talking, no demands, no warnings. This was an execution. The betrayal burned deeper than the attack itself. Humanity had trusted them, had believed in the fragile peace. And now, that trust was being repaid in fire. Adrian clenched his fists. He would not let humanity's faith be the reason they perished. Return fire. Target their lead battleship. The Resolute's railguns roared to life, unleashing devastating kinetic rounds that tore into the enemy's hull. Explosions erupted in the vacuum of space, but it was like striking a tidal wave with a sword. The Dominion ships kept coming, relentless and unyielding. Within minutes, they had surrounded the Resolute, bombarding its defenses from all sides. Adrian's second-in-command, Commander Lorna Hayes, turned to him, her expression grim. "We can't hold out like this. They want us destroyed." Adrian's mind raced. He had fought too many battles to go down like this. If they couldn't win, they had to survive. And for that, they needed a way out. Helm, prepare for an emergency warp. Set coordinates for the asteroid field near Rylos Prime. The pilot hesitated. "Sir, if we miscalculate, we could end up inside a rock. Do it." The ship shuddered as the warp drive activated, space twisting around them. A heartbeat later, they re-emerged amidst a chaotic field of spinning asteroids. The Dominion fleet was close behind, but now the battlefield had changed. The massive enemy warships struggled to maneuver, their sheer size working against them. "Use the debris for cover. Hit them with everything we have." Adrian barked the order, and the Resolute came alive. The ship weaved through the asteroid field, striking from the shadows, ambushing Dominion vessels before disappearing behind floating mountains of rock. One by one, enemy ships fell, unable to match the agility of the human warship. But the Dominion still had numbers on their side, and time was running out. The Resolute had taken heavy damage. Another direct hit to the engine core, and they wouldn't be able to escape. Then, amidst the chaos, a new transmission came through encrypted, human-coded. Adrian's eyes widened as the face of Admiral Jonas Calloway appeared on the screen. The Admiral's voice was urgent. "Captain, listen carefully. The Dominion attack wasn't just on your ship. It's a full-scale invasion. They struck all major Terran colonies simultaneously. We've been deceived. We need to regroup at Epsilon Station. We're launching a counteroffensive." Adrian's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was an attempt to wipe humanity from existence. But if the Dominion thought they could erase the human race, they had made a grave mistake. "Understood, Admiral. We'll fight our way there." The Dominion forces were closing in again, adapting to their tactics. Adrian knew they couldn't hold out much longer. Their only option was to escape to live long enough to strike back, divert all power to the engines, prepare for another emergency warp. The Resolute's frame groaned under the strain, but there was no other choice. As the ship jumped away, leaving the battlefield behind, Adrian's thoughts burned with a single purpose. This wasn't over. Humanity had been betrayed, but they would not be broken. The fight for survival had just begun. The distress signal was weak, barely detectable against the background noise of deep space, but Captain Daniel Reeves knew better than to ignore it. The Endeavour had been patrolling the outer edges of human-controlled space when the signal had appeared, a desperate call from a species humanity had never encountered before. The message was garbled, a mix of unfamiliar words and desperate cries, but the meaning was clear: they were dying. And they needed help. Reeves stood on the bridge, watching as the alien planet came into view. The world was desolate, its once thriving cities now reduced to hollowed ruins. The atmosphere was thick with a toxic haze, and the scanners detected no signs of sustainable life. But beneath the surface, deep underground, there were faint energy-reading survivors. He turned to his crew. "Prep the shuttle. We're going down." As they descended, the truth of the planet's fate became clear. It had been attacked, not by nature, but by war. Craters from orbital bombardment scarred the landscape, and the skeletal remains of towering buildings spoke of a civilization that had once stood proud before being crushed under merciless fire. But who had done this? And why? The entrance to the underground bunker was hidden beneath layers of debris, but as Reeves and his team cleared a path, the massive steel doors slid open with a hiss. A group of figures emerged, tall, slender beings with translucent skin and luminous eyes. They were weak, their movements slow, but their expressions were unmistakable. Hope. The tallest among them stepped forward and spoke in a strained electronic voice, translated through the Endeavor's linguistic software. "You came," it said, voice trembling. "We did not believe anyone would answer." Reeves studied the alien, trying to piece together the mystery. "Who did this to you?" The alien hesitated, then gestured for them to follow. Deep within the bunker, Reeves saw the full extent of the devastation. Thousands of their kind lay in stasis pods, barely alive, their bodies ravaged by malnutrition and sickness. The machines keeping them alive were failing, and without immediate intervention, they would all perish. But it was the records stored in the bunker that revealed the true horror. The aliens, who called themselves the Centauri, had once been a powerful and peaceful race. Their knowledge of genetics and medicine far surpassed humanity's, their culture built on cooperation rather than conquest. But they had made one mistake: they trusted the wrong species. A race known as the Varkesh had come to them as allies, promising trade and friendship. But when the Centauri shared their technology, the Varkesh turned on them, erasing their cities in a single, merciless campaign. The Centauri had been deemed a threat, their advancements too dangerous to be allowed to exist. And now, only these few survivors remained, clinging to the last remnants of their world. Reeves felt a deep anger burning inside him. This was genocide. Cold, calculated extermination. And it wasn't just about the Centauri, it was about what the Varkesh would do next. If they were willing to wipe out an entire species simply because they were too advanced, what would stop them from turning their sights on humanity? "We won't let you die here," Reeves said, his voice firm. "We'll take as many of you as we can aboard the Endeavor." The Centauri leader's glowing eyes widened. "You would do this for us?" Reeves nodded. "No one deserves to be erased. We won't stand by and let it happen." It was a race against time. The ship could not carry all of them, but they could save enough to rebuild. The crew worked tirelessly, loading as many as possible into the shuttles, securing medical aid for those who could still be saved. But as they prepared to leave, the sensors picked up a terrifying signal: Varkesh warships inbound. They had come to finish what they started. Reeves knew there was no chance of victory in a direct fight. The Endeavor was fast but outgunned. Their only option was to run. "Get everyone on board. Now!" The engines roared to life as the ship lifted off, the Varkesh fleet breaking through the planet's upper atmosphere. Laser fire streaked past them, barely missing the hull. Alarms blared across the bridge as the shields absorbed the impact of a near-direct hit. "Punch the warp drive," Reeves shouted. The ship lurched forward, tearing through space just as the Varkesh weapons locked onto their position. The Endeavor vanished in a burst of energy, escaping into the safety of deep space. The battle was over for now. The Centauri survivors gathered in the ship's medical bay. Reeves watched as their leader approached him once more. "You saved us," the alien said, voice filled with something deeper than gratitude. "Our people, we owe you everything." Reeves shook his head. "No. We did what was right. And we'll make sure the Varkesh never do this again." The bond had been formed, one that could not be broken. Humanity had saved the last of a dying species. And in return, they had gained something far greater: an ally. A friend. And perhaps, in the end, the key to their own survival.